Functions give you an ability to hold a block of executable code and then call to it just like you were with variables.
This video is brought to you by EpiPies Academy.
But you can execute a number of lines of code and actually output a whole bunch of functionality within this type of format. So in order to create a function within JavaScript, we define it by function, and then we need to give the function a name. So I'm going to just call it myFun, and then we've got the rounded brackets and then the curly brackets and everything contained within here. So this is the contents of the function. So all of this is the code that actually gets rendered out. And the naming convention is very similar to what we do with variables, where we can't start it with a number, we can't start it with any odd characters, so we can't do those types of things. We can, however, start it with a $, an underscore, and so on. So same format that we used creating variables, we need to create functions as well with that same type of format. So let's create, so now we've created a function, we need to have some code that actually executes within that function. So we'll do our favorite thing where we've got a console log, and let's just output function was run, so that we know that every time we call myFun, we run the function. And that's the really good thing about functions, is that you can run them multiple times, so running that same bit of code multiple times. So let's see what happens within our output. And you can see here within the output that we're actually able to render out multiple values there. Just fix that a little bit so we can see it a lot clearer, because we're just focusing on what the console is outputting. So we see that function was run, function was run, function was run, gets rendered out from that same line of code, which is line number 3. And this way we can see that we can actually see something happening with those functions. Now there is a way to run and add dynamic values into the functions. So let's say, for instance, we had a value of A, this one has a value of B, and then this one just doesn't have a value at all. So we can pick up those values, those arguments, within the function when we're executing that out. So again, we can assign any variable value to it. So let's just go ahead and assign A, and let's do A, and then concatenate it with the string value here, function was run. And let's go back out and refresh our code, and we can see that now the function was run, the value of A was run, so A function was run, B function was run, and this one we hit undefined. So we do have a value of A there, so it's not coming back that there's no value for A, it just hasn't been defined, it hasn't been declared, it doesn't contain anything within that value, that variable A. So you can give it actually a default value, so just write default there. And now when I render out that code, so now I've got it here at the bottom, and I render out that code, we can see that it actually renders it out and sees that we're rendering out the default function was run. So this way, even though we're not passing any arguments there, we can actually see some type of output there within our console log. And this way we can actually begin to create some meaningful code within our functions. So another thing with functions we can do as well is we can perform different calculations. So instead, for instance, if the numbers were, if these were numeric values, so 5, 6, and A was maybe 3, we could perform a mathematical calculation. We could do A times 5, and then function was run. So let's go back out and refresh that. So we see we've got 25, 30, 15, because now it's taking that, still that default value of 3 and outputting 5. Let's also introduce variables. And this is another important part of JavaScript, is understanding how we work with variables. We can work with global variables and local variables. And right now, if we're declaring a value of B and giving it a value of 10, what if we want to actually access it within our function? So we want to do whatever value you're passing times b. So let's see what happens here. And when we render that out, we see that we get a times b equals 50, a times b, which is 10, equals 60, and 3 times 10 is 30. So we are able to access these global variables within our functions. But what happens if I do variable c equals 100, and then over here, even though I've run the function, I want to output the value of c. So let's see what happens now. And this is really important to understand, that the way that functions handle variables, there's a local scope, which is if you declare any variables that are specifically used within this function, they're going to only be available within the function themselves. So we're not able to access a variable that was declared in the function outside of the function. And if we do want to have a value for c, we need to specify that over here. So c equals 1 and so on. So let's refresh it again. And what do you think the output for c is going to be? Now take a close look at what's happening with the code here within the function, and what do you think the output for c is going to be for the console? And if you said 1, you are correct, because the value of c, the global value of c is 1. And because we're calling it within the console globally, we're only able to access the value of c being 1 over there. And because we're defining a new value for c, which is locally within the function, we're going to see that that value of c within that function itself is going to be 100. So we see that that gets output there. So be careful when you are using functions that you're not mistakenly redeclaring variables and thinking that you're going to use one of the ones out here, but then you're declaring something different in here, and you've got multiple same name functions. So try to avoid that if possible. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, what if I just do c like that? What do you think the value is going to be? And if you said 100, you are correct, because what's happening here is c is given a value of 1. We hit the first myFun, goes through the function, executes the snippet of code, and sets the value of c, because now this is globally declared. So now it sets the value of c at 100. Now there's another thing that's another really useful function within functions, is that it can actually return values. So we can do something where we can return the value of a times b and return that value into the output. So what happens now if I refresh it? We don't actually see a difference. But what if I was to, let's give variable d a chance here, and we're going to do d, and then we're going to do d plus a value of d. So we're actually going to be creating a value for d, and let's output it over here, and then also do the same thing for this value of d. And let's output value of d over here. So let's go out here, refresh it. Let's run through the code again right now. So we see that, maybe I should comment these out so to avoid any confusion, and refresh it. So we're only getting those values of d. So the first time we run a value for d, we're outputting it over here within line 14. We're getting 50, then we're getting 110, and we're getting 140. So basically d is being set by the returned value of the function. So we're running through that function, we're sending 5 in the value of a, we're doing a times the value of b, which is 10, and that's where we're getting 50 returned back over here. And then next we're adding another value, myFun 6, to the value of d. So now that's creating an interactive and incrementing that value. So we're doing myFun 6, passing it over, so a becomes 6. So 6 times 10 is 60, so that gets returned as 60. So the same thing as adding 60, adding 50, or this should be setting it as 50. So see that we're working with those returned values, and we're implementing them within that value of d. And then next, we've got a value of my fun, which there's no value being declared there, so we're getting 30, or 3, and then times 10 again, because b is equal to 10, so we're returning 30, and we're adding 30 to it, and that basically means that we've got 110, and we're adding 30, returning back 140. So there's quite a lot you can do with functions, and they become very powerful. So you can add any number of lines of code here. You can have functions within functions and so on. And this gives you a lot of control as to what you can do with the script and a lot of manipulation you can do with these variables that we set up in the earlier lessons. Now that we've learned more about functions, we're going to jump back into arrays, and I'm going to show you some of the really cool things you can do with arrays in the upcoming lesson.